This is an update of a presentation I made back in 2017 on dome ports and water contact ports and lenses for underwater photography. I've divided the talk in two to make it easier to watch online, and in this, the second half, we're going to dive into those water contact lenses and ports that are a really exciting frontier in underwater photography. I really recommend watching part one of this talk first, unless you know your underwater optics stuff off pat. Understanding all that dome port theory really helps you appreciate the advantages that water contact optics bring for our photography. Although I'm going to give some historical examples, this talk focuses on the lenses and ports that I have the most direct experience, which in my opinion are the best options out there. You can assume, I think, if other lenses or ports were as good as the ones I was using, then I'd have made effort to seek them out and use them for my own photography. I've been shooting with a variety of different water contact optics for at least my last sort of 1,000 dives or so. So I think I have pretty good insight into what's really worth using. Just to remind you, this talk is aimed at full frame photographers. And in this part particularly, I'm going to talk a lot about, apertures, and I'm very much relating that to full frame photography. There are advantages in water contact lenses for non-full frame photographers, but the advantages are biggest for full frame photographers wanting to realize the full potential of their high resolution, high quality cameras. And again, I want to emphasize that the focus of this talk is on image quality, not quality imagery. Appreciating and using water contact optics won't make you a better photographer, but it does have the possibility, with very little effort, to improve the quality of every wide angle picture you take. This shot here was taken with the WACP-1, as we'll get on to shortly. The theory of water contact optics is pretty straightforward. Flat ports and even dome ports have optical compromises when used underwater. Domes are pretty good, but they require us to close the aperture of our lens right down to at least f13 on a full frame camera to be sure to avoid that blurriness in the corners of the frame. Lenses and ports specifically corrected to work in water have far less of these compromises, assuming that they're well made and well designed, of course. The Nikonos lenses, like this, are the most famous. I guess in short, water contact optics give us sharper corners, minimize that field curvature, have less chromatic aberration, and thus deliver superior image quality over a much wider range of apertures than any sort of flat or dome port. But they're usually more expensive because of the specialist design and build, and they usually have some usability compromises in some situations. And for you, the image quality advantage might not be that significant. And I'm going to try and give a very balanced account of each, pointing to the positives, but also being critical of their shortcomings. Again, I want to begin with a little bit of history. Water contact optics are nothing new. People have been trying them since the early days. This is a photo of one of Cousteau's team of divers in the 60s and 70s, and they used these ground aspherical dome ports rather than simple concentric domes to try and partly correct their camera lenses. And there have been plenty of interesting solutions down the years. Many, I think, are really worth revisiting, and I want to kind of to flag a few of them up here, hopefully to bring them to the attention of someone out there. This is Francois Laurent's Corrector, which was developed for filming in Luc Besson's The Big Blue film, which I'm sure most of you have enjoyed many times. It's an spherical port, so it's a sort of a dome port, but but not concentric dome ports, so different shape on each side. And it's used in conjunction with internal correcting lenses that mount on the front of the camera lens. Another famous example is from Elcan, which stands for Ernst Lights Canada, the company that made them. And they built underwater housings for sort of commercial applications, particularly the military a lot, and actually designed and built both water contact lenses and water contact corrector ports to a really high standard. Although I've never actually heard from anyone who shot one or actually ever seen photos taken with one, but they do have a really great reputation amongst people who know about these things. By far the best known water contact optics, though, are the Nikonos lenses. And there was a time in underwater photography when you'd never have to explain what Nikonoses were, but that's almost 20 years ago now. And these days there's a lot of confusion about the two main types of Nikonos lenses. Throughout their sort of evolution, there were 6 main Nikonos cameras. The final one was the unusual one. That was the Nikonos RS, which was an autofocus SLR camera, so single lens reflex camera, and it sold in pretty small numbers, and we'll come back to that later in the talk. The ones that most people know about as Nikonoses are the Nikonos 1 through to 5, which sold for decades and in very large numbers, especially the Nikonos 3 and the Nikonos 5. I still have a 3 and 2 5s. Anyway, those cameras, the Nikonos 1 to 5, were rangefinder cameras, not SLR cameras. So you didn't ever look through these lenses. you look through a separate viewfinder, and the lenses were completely manual. They had manual focus and manual aperture controls on the side of them, adjusted by the big knobs you can see on the left hand side of the slide here. Also, not all Nikonos lenses were actually water contact, and only one of these rangefinder lenses, the Nikonos 15mm, the one in the picture here, is really of interest today. Although this lens is manual focus, it can be mounted with adapters to sit on the front of mirrorless digital cameras. So far for stills, I think this has only been done for Sony cameras, but I don't actually see why it couldn't be done for others, and I'm interested to know if there are, Nikons and Canon full frame mirrorless cameras that have been used with these lenses. I know some different video cameras have, so it really should be possible. Anyway, the lens is reasonably wide on full frame camera, and the optics are very good, but its limitations are that it's manual focus and it's manual aperture only, which can make it cumbersome for stills shooting in particular, and it's very much, I think, better as a video lens than as a stills lens. It's not so difficult to make water contact lenses in this style for those who really know about these things. The problem is that the market size is very small, and they're expensive to build without the economies of scale of lots of people wanting them. And most of us feel that the lack of autofocus and manual aperture settings would leave us missing a lot of shots. This is a prototype of a water contact fisheye lens that Nauticam made back in 2016 for full frame cameras, and it worked great. It offers superior image quality. But I think the feeling was that the increased risk of missing a shot because of that manual focus just wouldn't justify the price of buying this lens, when most people would just prefer to use their autofocus lens behind a dome port, so it never made production. But that knowledge wasn't wasted. Nauticam's first commercial water contact wide-angle lens came out in 2015, the WWL-1, which stands for the Wet Wide-Angle Lens #1, and is well loved by Micro Four Thirds shooters, although it isn't so well known to a lot of full-frame shooters. It can actually be used on a Sony full-frame camera with a 28mm prime lens, but there aren't any really suitable lenses to be able to use it on Nikon and Canon full-frame cameras that I'm aware of. The Micro Four Thirds gang, the Panasonic and Olympus 2x crop shooters, shoot it with a 14mm lens, usually a 14 to something zoom that gives it 130 degrees wide angles. And at 130 degrees, it's wider than almost all sort of rectilinear lenses out there, but narrower than the less distorting fisheyes. And as many users and lovers of this lens tell me, they love the image quality it produces and the contrast that it gives to pictures, even when shot through a lot of water. It really works very well. This is the only one of two graphs in this part of the talk, but it's actually some test data Nauticam collected and I've plotted up. These are actually Nauticam's in-house tests of the WWL-1 against their best dome port and lens combination for the same camera, and another wet lens that was on the market at the time, which is remaining anonymous here. Nauticam didn't want me to say what lens that is, but it's another one that's out there. Anyway, just to explain the graph, the vertical axis is the resolution. So the higher the lines on this, the more the resolving power of the lens. And all this data is collected in the corner of the picture, so that, it's the corner sharpness where that critical problem is with wide angle optics. And across the bottom of the graph is the lens aperture. So you can see how the image quality in the corners improves as the aperture is closed down, because with the dome ports, that's actually pulling more of that virtual image back into focus, as we talked about in the first half of the talk. Anyway, the important sort of takeaway from this is that the green line, which is the WWL-1 and a 1442 lens, has got the highest resolution across the board, and that line is relatively flat as well. Yes, it does improve as you shut the apertures down a little bit, but generally the line's pretty flat. The second line is a much more expensive lens, the 7 to 14mm lens, behind a very good 180mm dome. It works very well, but it doesn't work as well as the water contact lens. By about f11, it's just about catching up to where the WWL was at f4. The bottom lens is another wet lens, which I'm not going to go into details on, but just a reminder that just because something is sold as a wet lens or a water contact lens doesn't mean it's necessarily good. And in this case here, it's inferior in this test to a dome port. But I think the main message is that a relatively cheaper lens behind the WWL-1 is outperforming a very expensive lens behind a dome port, because the bottleneck for image quality is that dome port, not the lenses. I've not shot the WWL much, but I'm going to run this video, which has got sound as well. I'm not sure the sound's going to come through. Anyway, I'll run this video shot by Peter Rowlands when he was testing a pre-release version of this lens back in 2015, and I'm actually in the video. You can see me there. I'm actually shooting here the next lens that we're going to talk about, as the seal is playing with my leg. So these are shots with my camera. But you'll see Peter's available light footage with the WWL-1 and how the lens is very sharp. The corner sharpness is very good. The detail, the contrast the lens is producing, really strong. And the seal, of course, is very, very cute. Peter had his seal fins on. When we dive in the UK, we always use those with seals. We either use colourful fins or floppy split fins because the seals really love them. I didn't have them on, so Peter got all the seal action on this day. Anyway, the next water contact optic I want to discuss is the Nikonos RS 30mm. That was the lens I was shooting in the previous clip. This lens was sold during the early 1990s along with the Nikonos RS camera, which was Nikon's fully amphibious autofocus SLR camera. To be honest, the autofocus on the RS was actually its weakness, as it was already out of date when the camera was launched. It came from an old camera called an F601, which had been long surpassed by the time this camera finally came to market. And that really did, for the RS, it was one of the main reasons it wasn't a big success, is that a lot of underwater photographers just preferred using their housings. Despite the fact that the RS had these amazing lenses, which were water contact lenses, and they remain the only autofocus underwater wide-angle lenses that anyone has produced to date. The standout amongst them to want to use these days is the 13mm fisheye, which you can see in these pictures here, which sees about 170 degrees. It's a little narrower than a fisheye behind a dome port. All the other lenses from the RS are generally just not really wide angle enough to be really worth the effort of converting and using these days. I first shot this lens in the 1990s on my RS, but I started using it again in 2014, and it's been specially adapted to work on my digital Nikon SLRs, and a number of people have done this, both for Nikon SLRs and also for some video cameras that can accept Nikon lenses. It does require some rewiring, reprogramming to make it work, but being a water contact lens, it has excellent optics and suffers far less with field curvature than a dome, so it can be shot much more open. This hammerhead shot was shot at f10, and not that anyone ever looks in the corners, but the corners are really exemplary, despite being so wide open. This ability to shoot at more open apertures while preserving image quality and detail right throughout the frame is really valuable for fast-moving subjects, where a fast shutter speed has to be prioritised. Dolphins are a classic example. These were shot at f10. It's also really desirable in dark places, especially when working with available light. This Cenote image was shot at f8 at 1/25th of a second at ISO 250. Delivered really, really nice image quality. Or working with off-camera lighting, which is rarely as bright as you want it. And it causes, if you actually look at a lot of cave photography, a lot of cave shots, the corners go really smudgy. And that's because, photographers are struggling against the brightness of all the lighting and have to sacrifice their aperture a bit to get their remote strobes to show up as well as they want to in their pictures. Another advantage of this lens is actually got a very small size. So it gives you great image quality without a big dome, and that makes it great for close focus subjects, especially getting the light round the camera and the port and onto the front of the subject. So it's a really good lens for that. And the small size of the system is definitely a big benefit when shooting larger pelagic subjects, which may require sort of some swimming in open, which most pelagic subjects do, like this blue whale. Amos Nakum always used to tell a story, probably still does, about shooting humpbacks alongside two other photographers. And he was back in the old days, he was shooting a Nikonos 5 camera with a 15mm wide-angle lens on. And the other two were shooting housings. And because his camera was so much smaller, he was able to swim faster and really able to get into the prime position, that the other two with the big housings just couldn't push them through the water fast enough. So this small footprint can be really, really important when working with pelagic creatures. Of course, I have to say that a lot of the time when I'm shooting with the RS lens, I actually end up using apertures which are much more normal for wide angle in that f13, f14 lens, because this value kind of gives a good hyperfocal depth of field. By that I mean everything is in focus, your foreground and background are in focus. Unless I'm very, very close, then I might have to stop down a little bit more. But generally for most underwater shooting, that sort of range keeps everything sharp. And when you're using these apertures, it's actually much harder to really see any image quality advantage from the RS lens over one of the latest fisheye lenses, particularly the 8-15s, and a really good quality big dome. And obviously other times I might have to shut the lens right down to say f20, f22, and I think at those values you really wouldn't see any big difference, particularly when shooting into the sun or when I want to work with long exposures. But perhaps both of these examples, the smaller size of the frame definitely help the lighting of the subject close to the lens. And if you want to see more example shots, if you go onto my website, there's a search my images box on there, and if you type in 13.0 into that box, it'll bring up all the pictures taken with that lens. It tracks through the EXIF data and finds all the things. Don't type just 13, because then it'll bring up all the pictures taken at f13 or all the pictures taken on the 13th of the month or whatever. So type in 13.0 and it'll bring up all the lens pictures, and it brings up more than 700 if you really want to waste some time. I think in short, the main negatives about this lens is that it's for Nikon cameras only and maybe a couple of video cameras. And the supply of this lens is very limited, so they're actually very aggressively priced by anyone who's trying to sell one these days. They also can't shoot split levels, which if you're planning to do a lot of split levels on a trip means you need to still travel with a big dome and another fisheye. And also I have to say that the latest fisheye lenses and big domes are already really good when stopped down to that sort of f13 range on full frame. So there's less of an advantage of this expensive and unusual Nikonos lens in standard shooting. There's areas, particularly those dark shots, those ones where you need lots of shutter speed, etc., where it has a big advantage. But a lot of the time, maybe the advantage is less so. So it's something to consider if you have gear lust over this, is actually, does the photography you do really justify it? The next lens I want to talk about is my Ivanoff Corrector port, which is designed to correct land lenses for underwater use, using both the corrector port itself, the port itself, and a matched internal lens. The system is rectilinear, so it doesn't have any fisheye distortion. But the one I have, which I think is about the best one you could ever find anywhere, has a maximum field of view of about 90 degrees. So it's not that wide. It's actually very similar to a Nikonos 15mm lens, the rangefinder Nikonos lens, which is also about 90 degrees. The one I have is made by Zeiss, and the optical quality is really superb, which is not the case for all Ivanoffs. Again, like any lens system, based around a certain philosophy, there's good examples and bad examples, and there's a lot of quite poor Ivanoffs that really are worse than dome ports. Anyway, the image quality is really great, even when shot wide open. This picture here is shot at f2.8, but it doesn't have that corner blurring feel of a dome port shot, allowing me to take some really interesting and creative uses of shallow depth of field. More typically, of course, I shoot it around f8 to f14, and it's very valuable in those dark situations, allowing me to shoot at more open apertures and still having good corner performance. This picture here was taken at f9, and it's got detail running right into the corners of the frame. This cormorant hunting shot was shot at f10, this eagle ray at f11. All, I think, powerful shots, all with good corner performance. But a lot of the time, the best settings are in that normal range, because it's bright underwater, there's plenty of light, so I end up shooting at f13, f14, where perhaps it wouldn't have that much of an advantage over a dome port. I still feel, particularly with a rectilinear lens, it's nice to have this really good system that gives me flexibility to move to those wider apertures if I need to. There are a few negatives with this. I think the biggest negative I've found so far is it works really well with my Nikon 20mm lens, but I've tried loads of other lenses behind it, and even I found a really rare and hard to find, had to buy it from Japan, a Takina 20 to 35mm zoom lens, a really good quality lens, which I hope would give me a zoom capability with this lens, but it just doesn't work optically as well as my 20mm prime. So I'm kind of stuck with this as a very much as a prime solution. Also, the port that I use was made in very limited numbers in the 1970s. There are a few around, but they're really not easy to locate. So I'm always worried if I scratch mine, that'll be it. I'll never be able to use it. It won't be fixable, and I'll never be able to find another one. They also need to be modified to fit on a modern camera. And certainly when I started using it, I used to moan about how heavy it was to travel with. Although it's considerably lighter than the WACP-1 and especially the WACP-2, which I'm going to talk about next. So I guess these days you shouldn't really consider it especially heavy. So I'm going to finish the talk by talking about the two Nauticam lenses, which I think really have redefined this whole genre of water contact lenses. The first is the WACP-1, which stands for wide angle conversion port. I always get that wrong and call it a wide angle corrector port. This port is large, multi-element design, which both corrects for that water to air interface, but also stretches the angle of the lens behind it. So it works best with relatively simple lenses behind it, smaller older design lenses work best, and the ideal is a 28mm prime lens or a 28mm zoom lens, which it expands out to 130 degrees, which is a really nice angle to use. It's considerably wider than, say, a rectilinear 1635, which is only about 170 degrees, but it does produce some barrel or fisheye distortion, which doesn't bother me. But if you want a really rectilinear solution, maybe it doesn't have that really pointy look of a rectilinear lens. But the optics are absolutely excellent. It produces excellent image quality right into the corners of the frame at f8, and can be used a lot of the time even more open, f6.7, f5.6, like this picture here. When it's used with a 28-70mm zoom, it has a really wide effective range of zoom, which is really useful underwater, particularly when diving on sites you don't know what to expect. And despite using a relatively simple lens attached to the camera, the quality from the port is so good that the image quality is phenomenal. And it easily outperforms the best lenses behind a dome port that you can use in this range. It really is great. If you've seen this year's Wildlife Photography Year exhibition, this picture is there and it's printed really big. And this picture looks fantastic printed up big, and it's shot with the WACP-1. The zoom range of the lens is really great for medium and big subject, gangs of fish, schools of fish, individual large fish. It's super flexible. Reef scenes with big animals, wreck exteriors, wreck interiors. And for me, it's my go-to option for big animals of all sorts, cold and warm-blooded creatures. And it gives such a variety of shooting options. You can shoot animals, you can zoom out and shoot reef or scenery with the big animals. It works really, really well. And I think the other thing I'd say about it is, this is a picture of me on the right. Thanks, Sarah Gorman, for the picture. And it's although it's heavy on land, it's really easy to make it neutral underwater, and it's really quite a nice thing to handle in the water. The bulk of it isn't really a problem at all underwater. This is my final graph in the talk, and it's very similar to the previous one I showed. It's a graph of resolution with higher resolution, more resolving power the further up the graph you go, plotted against the lens aperture. And it shows a WACP-1. There's only one WACP at the time I did this graph, so it just says WACP. The green line at the top, which has obviously got the best resolving power, comparing that to a Nikon 14-24 behind a 230mm dome and a Canon 11-24 behind a 230 dome. And these are all real data collected in Nauticam's optical lab, comparing these systems, and these are using their lenses and their best domes. And what you can see is that it has a marked advantage over the other lenses at all the apertures. And it's generally about a 2 to 3 stop advantage from these tests. I would sort of clarify that a little bit by saying that neither for me the 14-24 or the 11-24, although they're both quite widely used, are the lens I would choose as a rectilinear wide angle. I think the best one is the 16-35, which isn't as wide as any of these, but it does work well behind a dome port. And I would say it's probably got a 2-stop advantage. The WACP has a 2-stop advantage over the 16-35, so slightly to the line for that. We've never done, I've not got the test data, but I would imagine it sits between the green and the blue line on this graph somewhere. The 16-35 would. Anyway, the big negatives of the WACP-1 are that it's expensive. It uses a lot of optical glass to make it. It's heavy, which makes it heavy for travel. Although actually both of those are very relative compared to the WACP-2 that's kind of redefined all of that. It does have noticeable fisheye distortion, less than a full fisheye lens, but more than a rectilinear lens. But personally, I do like the look of the shots it takes. I like that slight fisheye distortion. And for me, it's definitely my go-to for any big animal trip. Right, the final optic I want to cover is the WACP-2, which is on sale now, but I'm not sure if anyone's had a chance to use a production one with the lockdowns going on around the world at the moment. I had the chance to shoot it back in January and was really impressed with it. It gives a massive 140 degrees field of view, and it has a much more rectilinear look than the WACP-1. It works best with the latest wide-angle lens from the mirrorless Nikon and Canon cameras, the full-frame mirrorless cameras. And all my shots I've done with it were taken with a Nikon Z7 and 14-30mm lens. The shots definitely have a rectilinear look to them. There is some mild barrel distortion from this lens, but on the whole, straight lines look straight. It stretches stuff out. It's very flattering on people's silhouettes. And if that's a look you're after, it's definitely very appealing. It can be shot super open if needed. This reef scene, which is kind of often the most challenging type shot for corner sharpness, is taken at f5.6 on a full frame camera, and it looks great right into the corners. It really is. If you've done any sort of lens testing, this shot is just mind-blowing. The lens can also be shot even more open in certain situations. This picture here is shot on an f4, and obviously the dark foreground allowed me to use a super wide aperture. This shot shows how wide the lens is. I was actually very close to my buddy here, and this shark came between us, but I was still able to sort of get everything in the picture. It really is a wide view. And the image quality is fantastic at f8. And it is a very good big animal lens, although I have to say I personally prefer the more fisheye look of the WACP-1. But I know there's many talented shooters out there who prefer a more rectilinear look and will really love this lens. I guess I'm just too indoctrinated into underwater photography and my love of fisheyes. Unusually for a water contact lens, the WACP-2 can shoot split levels. However, while this lens is neutral and surprisingly easy to handle underwater because of the buoyancy it's got built into it, it's mega heavy out of the water. Even half out of the water to take a split level shot is really tough. So it's a really hard lens to shoot splits with. And furthermore, it doesn't have any optical advantage in shooting splits over a dome port, because you still need to shut the lens all the way down to get both the above water and the below water sections sharp. For me, the fact it can shoot splits is a bit of a red herring, and I wouldn't really make that as a major reason for getting it. The WACP-2 though is definitely got that next generation performance feel over the WACP-1 even, and it's incredible if you compare it to a dome port. It's amazing optically. There's no other way to say it. For me, it definitely performs better than the Nikonos 13mm. It is incredible lens what it can do, but it's huge and very heavy. It's not cheap at all, although it's actually less expensive than I thought it was going to be. But it's something that's there for people who want the ultimate performance, whatever it costs and whatever it takes to get it to the shoot. And I'm sure it will be very successful in that market. For me though, it's just a little bit too much to think about traveling with on a regular basis. In conclusion, I'd certainly stick to the conclusion that I had in my 2017 talk, that water contact lenses will increasingly become the future of wide-angle photography underwater. It'll probably take another 5, 6, 7 years for they're really widespread as people slowly buy them, but I really see that future is coming. But just as we didn't stop using flat ports, we will continue to use domes when their strengths suit us and the types of shots we want to take, and their weaknesses aren't significant. Over the last 6 years or so, I've made many wide-angle trips without even taking a dome port on them. But I've also done many trips where I've taken 2 or 3 dome ports with me, depending on the subjects I want to shoot. And the area I'd really love to see some more progress on are more dedicated underwater lenses with autofocus and all the trimmings that are water contact lenses. I think that would be my wish for the future. Not easy to engineer on the electronics side. The optics are hard enough. And actually the electronics are equally difficult because they challenge you in a very different way. But we can only wish. That's the SpaceX alarm, which I'm going outside to try and see now. So that's the end of the talk. Thanks very much.